Chapter 4. Meetings and Wine. 2 weeks had passed since Rufier first joined the army. Day by day, the grueling exercises and relentless drills had started to yield results. Each morning, as he glanced at his reflection in a nearby pond where he saw progress, his shoulders broadened, his stamina grew, and for the first time in a long while, Rufier felt a glimmer of something almost foreign. A quiet sense of joy. The nightmares still haunted him, lurking in the depths of his sleep, but during the day, he found solace in the routine, in the pain of training that drowned out the pain of loss. More than that, he found an unexpected friendship. Walter, a fellow recruit, had become a constant companion. He came from a family of hunters, and as the days went by, his tales of tracking game, selling furs, and shooting arrows with deadly precision captivated Rufier. Walter was everything Rufier wasn't. While Rufier was brooding and quiet, Walter was light-hearted, always quick with a joke or a laugh. He spoke of becoming a master archer someday, his eyes gleaming with ambition as he described how he could one day shoot targets from impossible distances. "I tell you, Rufier," Walter had said one morning as they trained with wooden weapons, "one day, I'll be out there. Arrows flying faster than you can blink, hitting targets a mile away. You'll see." Rufier had only given a small smile in response, but it was the most genuine one he'd had in a long time. On one such day, after the day's training had come to an end, Walter approached Rufier, wiping sweat from his brow. "Rufier, my friend," he said with his usual grin, "you hungry?" "Always," Rufier replied, his stomach rumbling in agreement. "Perfect. I know a good place to eat. Well, as good as it gets around here. But before that, I need to grab something. It's just nearby. You mind coming with me? Won't take long, I promise." Rufier hesitated for a second but then shrugged. He had grown to trust Walter's infectious energy, and besides, the thought of a meal with good company after another punishing day sounded too good to pass up. "All right, lead the way," Rufier said. With that, Walter clapped him on the back, his grin widening. "Great, let's go, then." As they walked, the sun had begun its slow descent, casting a golden light over the town. Rufier noticed that despite the tiredness in his muscles, there was a peace in the moment, a contrast to the darkness he'd carried for so long. Walter chatted about his hunting days, how he could track a deer for miles without making a sound, how his father had taught him to survive in the wilderness, and how he dreamt of one day teaching his own son those same skills. Rufier, listening, found himself wondering if he would ever feel that kind of joy again. But he pushed the thought aside as they continued down the street. After a few more minutes, Walter stopped outside the barracks pantry. "Wait here, I'll be just a moment. I left something important inside. Don't go anywhere." With a playful wink, Walter disappeared into the building, leaving Rufier standing outside. The air was cool, and as Rufier waited, he found his thoughts drifting. There was something comforting about Walter's presence, a reminder that perhaps not all was lost in this new chapter of his life. He leaned against the wall, watching the fading light of the sun. For the first time in a while, Rufier felt the tension in his chest loosen, as if, for a brief moment, the weight of his past wasn't crushing him. After a few moments of waiting outside, Rufier suddenly heard a loud crash from inside the pantry, followed by the distinct sound of shelves collapsing. His body tensed, his instincts kicking in. Without hesitation, he rushed inside, ready to help Walter in case he was hurt. Bursting through the door, Rufier was greeted by a chaotic sight. Walter stood in the middle of the room, laughing heartily, while a woman of small stature was sprawled on the floor beneath a large jar of wine that had tipped over. The wine spilled in all directions, soaking the floor and drenching the woman, who was now covered in crimson liquid, her face a mixture of surprise and embarrassment. Walter, between laughs, raised a hand to calm Rufier. Sorry, Rufier. Didn't mean to scare you, but it's not what it looks like." Rufier, still on edge from the sudden noise, blinked in confusion. "What happened?" Walter grinned mischievously. "I was trying to keep this one out of trouble," he said, gesturing to the woman still sitting on the floor. Every time she knows there's wine in the pantry, her eyes start shining like a star. And this, he motioned to the mess of broken shelves and spilled wine, is the result. The woman, her cheeks flushed, not just from the wine, slowly stood up, wiping her face as best as she could. She looked up at Ruffier with a mix of annoyance and a wry smile, while the wine dripped down from her hair. "You going to just stand there and stare, or help me clean this mess up?" she said with a raised eyebrow, but there was humor in her tone. Walter, still chuckling, whispered to Ruffier as the woman got to her feet, "Careful what you say around her. She may look small, but trust me, she's a monster." Ruffier, taken aback by the whole scene, couldn't help but crack a small grin himself. There was an undeniable energy in the air, a dynamic he hadn't expected. "Ruffier," Walter said, louder now and more formally, "meet my sister, Sigrid. The terror of the pantry, and as you can see, a menace to any poor jar of wine." Sigrid shot a mock glare at her brother before turning her gaze to Ruffier, her expression softening. "So, you're the friend Walter's been talking about, huh? Nice to meet you. Sorry for, well, this." She gestured to the chaotic scene around them. Ruffier nodded, amused despite himself. "I've seen worse," he said with a faint smile. Sigrid laughed, shaking her head as more wine dripped from her hair. "Well, I suppose introductions could have gone worse. But since Walter brought you here, I'm guessing we'll have dinner together? Or were you just planning to stand around and watch me drown in wine?" Walter clapped his hands together. "Dinner, yes, but first, let's clean up this mess. And next time, Sigrid, maybe try not breaking half the barracks just for a drink." As they all set to work tidying the wreckage, Ruffier found himself oddly at ease. Sigrid's fiery personality and Walter's good-natured humor were a welcome contrast to the intensity of the barracks. For the first time in what felt like ages, he felt something close to home, laughter, warmth, and the ease of companionship. And as they cleaned, Ruffier realized that maybe, just maybe, he had found a place where he could start to heal. During dinner, the atmosphere in the room was lively and filled with conversation. Sigrid's sharp wit and Walter's easygoing humor made the evening enjoyable, and they talked about all sorts of things. Sigrid's favorite foods, Walter's misadventures in the wilderness, and local gossip. One moment, they were laughing about a nearby market that sold pies the size of shields, and the next, the tone shifted as the conversation turned to darker topics. Sigrid casually mentioned the hanging of a heretic by the Order of the Lake, a local group that enforced strict religious laws. Walter, his usual grin fading slightly, brought up more serious news. Norska raiders had been spotted pillaging villages much farther inland than anyone expected. Their raids were growing more frequent and more brutal, even this deep into the heartland. When Ruffier heard the words Norska raiders, a chill ran down his spine. His hand, holding a piece of bread, tightened into a fist without him realizing it. His knuckles turned white, and as his grip became harder, the tension grew so fierce that blood from his palm started to stain the bread. He hadn't noticed until the room went silent. Walter and Sigrid exchanged a concerned glance before turning their eyes back to Ruffier. The joy of the evening evaporated in an instant. Walter's voice, usually light and carefree, grew serious. "Ruffier," he said slowly, his eyes searching Ruffier's face, "did it happen in your village?" Ruffier didn't speak right away. His chest felt heavy, and for a moment, the memories crashed over him like a wave, flashes of fire, screams, and the faces of those who didn't survive. "Yes," he finally said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "It was my village." The room remained quiet, the warmth of the evening now replaced by the cold weight of Ruffier's story. He looked at Walter and Sigrid, their expressions filled with a quiet concern, and decided to tell them what had happened. Something he hadn't spoken of since that terrible night. "It was 3 weeks ago," he began, his eyes distant, as though he were seeing the events unfold all over again. "The raiders came at night. I could only hear the screams when I was outside of the forest. They were everywhere. beasts from the frozen north, savage and merciless. They didn't just kill. They tortured people, made a spectacle of it. I tried to get to my family as fast as I could, but... He trailed off, the words catching in his throat. He swallowed hard and forced himself to continue. I found my wife and son. My son was only 6, too young to fight, too young to even understand what was happening. They, Rufier's voice cracked, and for a moment, he was silent. The image of his son's lifeless body flashed in his mind. His wife, who had tried to defend their home, lay beside him. Walter leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but serious. You don't have to, but Rufier shook his head, signaling that he needed to finish. I buried them myself, after I killed 7 of the raiders. 7 men I cut down in a rage I didn't know I had. I don't even remember how I did it. Just that when it was over, their bodies were at my feet, and the village was gone. Nothing was left. The room fell into a heavy silence. Walter and Sigrid didn't say a word at first, allowing the weight of Rufier's story to settle in. Sigrid's eyes softened, her usual sharp tongue silent as she absorbed the gravity of what Rufier had gone through. Walter, who had always been the one to make light of situations, sat quietly, his face reflecting something deeper, a shared sorrow, perhaps, or the understanding that some wounds could never fully heal. After a long pause, Walter finally spoke. I'm sorry, Rufier. I can't imagine. He stopped, shaking his head slightly as if he knew that words wouldn't be enough. Sigrid, for once not teasing or making a joke, nodded solemnly. Those bastards. They took too much from you. Rufier looked at them both and gave a small nod, grateful for their presence, even if there wasn't much more to say. He had carried that pain alone for so long, and now, for the first time, he had shared it with someone else. The burden didn't feel lighter, but at least he wasn't the only one holding it anymore. As the evening wore on, the conversation eventually shifted again, though more subdued this time. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a bond formed not through shared laughter but through shared pain. When Rufier finally left Walter and Sigrid, later that night, he walked with a strange mixture of heaviness and relief. His story was out in the open, and the world hadn't shattered. Perhaps there was more strength in him than he had realized.